Hi, I'm Jeannie Lauren Dowden for Conduit News, and today we have law professor Robert Steinbuch joining us today to talk about the newly released work regarding the proposed constitutional amendment on the Freedom of Information Act. Hi, Robert.
Hey, Jeannie, it's great to be with you again.
Absolutely. You as well. Like I mentioned, the Arkansas Transparency Group released the second draft of their FOIA work. This time it is split into two measures, an amendment and an act. Break that down for us. Talk to us what was just newly released.
Yeah, as we talked about, I think roughly last week,
yeah,
we had decided to split it so that we keep all the kind of high-level, big picture stuff in the constitutional amendment, as well as critically, as well as the process by which transparency law can be changed in the future, meaning that changes to transparency law that reduce transparency must come before the people. So that all goes in the constitutional provision, and then in the act, what we call an initiated act, and that simply means that the people bring it into existence. We put more details about what the Freedom of Information Act should look like today. We updated, not too much, by the way, but we updated.
Talk to us then why the group felt the need to, in the beginning, I don't know if it was necessarily talked about having two separate measures. Why did you all feel the need in this second draft that you all came to the conclusion that this is what needed to happen?
Yeah, because if you look at constitutional provisions, they can get somewhat wordy, but to a point. And we realized that all the stuff that we wanted to tackle would make the constitutional provision overwhelming, unwieldy. So that's why we split the two in half.
What type of feedback have you gotten so far, if any? Because I know this was just released earlier this week, but as a group, have y'all heard anything so far since it's been released?
We've gotten some wonderful feedback, positive feedback, but also legitimate questions from folks saying, I'm not sure what this means or how this operates. One noted person said to us, okay, here are a few examples. How would the law apply to each of these examples? Those are great questions. And we're going to get back on that. And already has stimulated thoughts for minor tweaks, but tweaks nonetheless in some of the language that we're employing. But that's the whole point. It's about transparency. So we are, I dare say, transparent in our process, and we welcome feedback all along the way. And that stands, of course, in contrast to the Attorney General's not working group on the FOIA. That's entirely
okay. We'll get to that in a second, Robert, but let's keep talking about this transparency group before we jump over to that, because I have questions about that.
Got it.
Also, in the press release that the transparency group released, they mentioned that they're going to create a commission. Let's talk about that commission and the purpose of that commission to help Arkansans.
Yeah, indeed. So, you know that if you seek records, for example, there are other circumstances, but perhaps the best example is if you seek records from a government entity and it says no, well, the only recourse thereafter is to go to court.
Yeah.
And for most Arkansans, that's a hill they can't climb. I'm an attorney. I can file a lawsuit. But most individuals can't. Don't get me wrong, they're permitted to, but it's so technical that it's overwhelming, and then they're stuck. And I tell you this, I know it for a fact, that there are plenty of government bureaucrats across the state who rely on that fact. And they deny citizens their rights to records because they rely on the fact that those citizens won't be able to bring suit. And the idea behind the commission is that the average citizen can go to this new body and say, look, I'm entitled to these records, and please help me. Please tell them they must give it. And of course, evaluate whether I'm right on that. And that's the main purpose. There's also a second purpose, though, that courts have already said correctly, that if a citizen makes a FOIA request that is overwhelmingly large. Now, mind you, that's the devil's in the detail in that.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, and we can come back to that. If it's overwhelmingly large and an entity simply can't comply within the required 3 days that is in the statute today, then the court's not going to make them do something that can't physically be accomplished.
Yeah.
So the commission also will entertain that issue from government entities, but in a very organized and limited fashion, so that it's not a get out of the 3-day rule automatic card for government entities. Quite the contrary. The government entities would need to chin a high bar to get out of the 3-day rule and have a schedule created by the commission. So we saw both of those purposes as important in allowing for citizens to get their access that they deserve.
I think that's fantastic. I know you're familiar with this. We have spoken to countless people who were requesting documents and were just meeting roadblock after roadblock, and it was not going to happen unless really a lawsuit. You know, it was, and a lot of times your average Arkansan cannot cross that hurdle. And so I think this commission is fantastic just to have a resource to go to just for guidance. That's what they need. They need help in uncovering and figuring out a way to do this. So I think that's great. Anything else you want to talk about with this second draft?
Well, hopefully all the great listeners or watchers of Conduit News will watch this and then pull up a draft and take a look. We are open. Say again?
Well, we have it on our website, and
Right.
so I'll link it here
Right.
on this interview, as well as a link to the group and the Facebook group, so that way they can get plugged in, as well as the website. So we've been
That's right.
consistently sharing that.
It's wonderful. And we've been getting comments, I'm sure, in part through the access that people have gotten from Conduit News, because it truly is all about the people's input and transparency. You can't do this legitimately any other way.
Speaking of transparency, you were saying that in contrast to the AG's task force.
No.
Claim is that
it's not a task force. It's a working
group.
Right.
It's a working group.
Or the not working, whatever, however you want to characterize it.
I read the Attorney General Tim Griffin's op-ed in the Democrat-Gazette FOIA Working Group's Path Forward. And Steinbuch, you must be renting some space in his head right now. I don't know what's going on with y'all. And then your op-ed that came out today. Let's talk about it.
Yeah. Well, it's really an embarrassment for the AG's office, I dare say. It's unfortunate. There's that old saying that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And this is the first time we've seen Tim Griffin in charge of a constitutional office, and he's gone off the rails. I mean, this is not normal behavior, frankly. And so he comes out and writes this opinion piece, just personally attacking me. But here's the thing, he can call me all sorts of bad names he wants. If that's what he had done, he could have gotten away with it. People just say, well, either I agree or I don't agree. But what he did instead was lie to the people of Arkansas. And so he says things like, how dare Steinbuch call the FOIA book his book? You know what Tim Griffin wrote in a letter in December of 2020? His book about my book and about me. Tim Griffin says, oh, Steinbuch runs around calling himself an expert. By the way, I don't run around calling myself an expert. I almost never use that term because it sounds a little bit self-congratulatory. Now, for someone who's a politician, they're used to doing that. I'm not used to doing that. But I will raise it if someone who is disgruntled and doesn't like the opinions and facts that I state in my book dismisses the book as being irrelevant. I will point out that it's based on years of research in years of accomplishment. And so he criticizes me. He says, how dare Steinbuch essentially call himself an expert? In 2020, December 2020, you know what Tim Griffin called me? An expert. Take a look. I invite the audience to look at my column in today's Democrat-Gazette. It's Friday, the 17th. And I go point by point. I mean, if you, and I posted on Facebook, and maybe you'll post also, the letter from December 2020 that Tim Griffin wrote. He says, that Steinbuch, as the co-author of the authoritative work called the Arkansas Freedom of Information Act, that he is, right, that I'm the co-author of it. Now, by the way, in his column, he says, yeah, Steinbuch barely did anything. Now, of course, that's absurd. How would he even know that? Clearly, he hasn't read the book. And the fact is, the first edition that I co-authored, my co-authors insisted I take double the royalties. And thereafter, they told me to take over the project entirely. And I'm on the second sole authored version. So it's really quite silly. But he even goes on and he says, his book, remember, he criticized me for using that terminology, but Griffin says his book is routinely cited by Arkansas courts and practitioners as the definitive explication of the Arkansas FOIA. In fact, the Arkansas Supreme Court has relied on Professor Steinbuch's analysis in major decisions involving the FOIA. This has led to his membership on the Arkansas Freedom of Information Act Task Force, a statutorily created body that advises the Arkansas legislature on FOIA amendments. Isn't that interesting? He recognizes what the task force does, but then his not working group completely bypasses the task force. Why didn't he come to the task force for help with rewriting the FOIA if he recognizes that's a statutorily created body that advises the legislature on FOIA amendments? Isn't that odd?
Yeah, it is interesting how the FOIA task force that you all have worked relentlessly, session after session, but yet we're left out this past session on some just monstrous pieces that and it's obvious why.
Look, it was left out. David Ray, the state rep from here in Central Arkansas, introduced both a bill at the end of the general session and in the special session that would undermine the Freedom of Information Act.
Yeah.
The Attorney General's office testified in favor of the first bill, in favor of that first bill. And so there's no surprise that they're not interested in the FOIA task force when the FOIA task force said about both of those bills that those bills were terrible. Those bills would be bad for the state of Arkansas. So they don't want our input.
Yeah,
Okay.
but it is common for the AG's office to have working groups on various topics, whether it's gun laws or, other issues. It's not uncommon for them to have a working group.
There's never been a working group created by the Attorney General on the Freedom of Information Act. In fact, the Attorney General points to the commission that was created by Sarah Sanders' father, or under his time. It was created by the legislature to advise on changing the FOIA, on updating the FOIA. So why haven't we done the same thing? How is it that the AG's office has taken upon itself to do that role? In fact, there was a second time I think it was during the second time that was under the governor's father, irrespective of my lack of good memory as to which time it was. The second time, the legislature again created a task force to update the Freedom of Information Act when it came to certain other matters. Both times that there was a decision made to update the FOIA, it was through a legislatively created body, never but by the AG, never such a hubris to take on that role himself without input from any of the constituent groups. And that was the difference. Each of those previous bodies had appointees from constituent groups. And now we have in place a permanent body to do exactly what Tim Griffin's non-working group is, he claims, designed to do. Our group, the task force, the people's group, created by the legislature, as he said, is a statutorily created body that advises the Arkansas legislature on FOIA amendments. Why not come to that? No, he saw fit to create his own not working group instead.
What do you say in his op-ed, though? He claims that it is a bipartisan group, and he lists those that are members of it. What do you say to that?
Well, it's interesting. He's correct. It is bipartisan. So that is a true statement. That's a wonderful statement. It has nothing to do with nothing, but it's a wonderful statement. I'm sure they all wear socks to the meetings. That would be a true statement too. Also irrelevant. Here's what I can tell you about the bipartisan group. Every one of the representatives on Tim Griffin's not working group that is pro FOIA is also on this constitutional amendment group. Every one of them. Every one of Tim Griffin's appointees who isn't pro FOIA, every one of them, none of them are on the constitutional amendment group. Doesn't that tell you something? Doesn't that tell you something? And those others, by the way, 3 of the 4 are either current or former employees of his. And the 4th was the co-sponsor of the very bill that we discussed already, that would have undermined the Freedom of Information Act.
Yeah. I think, what do I know? But
quite a bit, I think.
I think what I hear from some conservatives and Democrats, I think a lot of people are falling on the same page with this. They would like to see those in office right now, when things get contentious, this being an example, or other issues, FOIA, the lectern, whatever it may be, rather than seeing our elected officials and our leaders go on the defensive and attack and name call and make it personal, rather than it be that, we would love to see there be more accountability and transparency and ownership, because that's when you win over your base, and that's when you win over the voters, and that's when you draw them back in. When you go on the attack, and when you're visibly seen as being threatened, when it seems that your power and position is threatened, and you go on the attack and you appear defensive, that is not good, especially going into primary season. For speaking as a conservative network, for Republicans going into primary season, that is not a unifying look. And that's just, again, what do I know? But
well,
indeed,
sadly, Jenny, it's not the first time. And I spoke this summer at a kids' Constitution camp.
Yeah.
And this was after, I think I mentioned it to you, this was after a disabled veteran wrote a letter to the editor regarding the FOIA bill and the FOIA non-working group from the Attorney General's office. And that disabled veteran was there, and Tim Griffin buttonholed him and accused him of writing that letter, of being my shill in writing that letter. Of course, he denied
What are
that.
you afraid of? What are these, like,
Right.
and I'm not talking about Griffin. This is not an attack on Griffin or anyone else, but it's like, what are you afraid of? What ideas are these politicians afraid of?
I'll give you another example. It's a great question. I'll give you another example. Gwen Moritz is an editor at Arkansas Business.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Arkansas Business wrote an editorial critical of Tim Griffin's non-working group. Gwen Moritz didn't write the editorial.
Yeah.
And the Attorney General wrote a nasty response saying that Gwen Moritz or the paper rather failed to disclose Gwen Murrett's relationship with the chair of the FOIA task force. First of all, she did, because she had written her own opinion piece a few weeks or so prior, and she said, my husband's the chair of the FOIA task force.
Yeah.
But are you telling me also that the paper should repeat that in its criticism of the AG? It's really rather desperate.
Well, I don't know, Robert.
Indeed.
It's you know, I always appreciate your insight, and again, this is the one thing that we stand for at Conduit. It is accountability, it is transparency, and if you don't have that, what are you left with?
Nothing.
Nothing. Nothing.
It is the law that precedes all laws. In fact, the Attorney General, in one of his response screeds prior to this response screed, said, "Oh, some people want to put the FOIA up there with the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution." Well, you know, here's the funny part: is maybe just a notch below, pretty close. That's how important it is to us, to we the people, not to the Attorney General, but to us, it is that important.
It is
just below. It is the law. It is the statute that sort of precedes all other statutes, because everything else relies on us knowing how government operates. And if we don't know how government operates, everything else they do is called into question.
Well, we have reached out to Attorney General Griffin's office for an interview. We'd love to have him come on to talk about FOIA and also any other issues that are important to his office. So we hope that he does that. Well, we'll continue to follow this. Thank you so much, Robert.
Thank you.
Anything else you want to add before we let you go?
Look forward to being back on Conduit News in the near future.
We'll see you next week.